And usually I record these in the afternoons. It's actually morning right now. Just woke up a little while ago. Got my teacher mug with me full of coffee. And I gotta be honest, this is kind of the day that I was shift, so you can see a little more face in there. All right. This is honestly, when I was looking at going chapter by chapter through Matthew, this is both the day I was maybe most looking forward to, and also was the most intimidating. I've mentioned this a little bit before. If you're pretty familiar with questions on end times things, eschatology, questions of how biblical prophecies in the New Testament are fulfilled, you're familiar probably with some of the controversy on the Olivet Discourse. So, this whole section on Matthew 24 is probably one of the more debated verses, chapters in all of the Bible, mainly because of the issue of dating. So there's a question of what is Jesus talking about here, and how do we understand this? I am not going to be really great at describing all the camps because there's a lot of different variation within all these camps. But basically, it's helpful to think in terms of three different schools of thought, different types of interpretation of Matthew 24. There are those who would say that almost all of the prophecies in Matthew 24 relate to the destruction of the temple and the siege of Jerusalem, which took place in AD 70. So Jesus was looking forward to an activity that was going to happen, but was more near future rather than far-flung future when he spoke of it. There's also those who say none of this applies to that, and they would say that all of this refers to the second coming, the last days of the earth, before Christ comes and judges the world, and we have the second coming and all that, and all the things we've kind of already talked about in Matthew's Gospel. And like I said, Jesus talks about that in Matthew's Gospel, the idea of a final judgment where God separates the righteous from the wicked and all those things. So there is those people who think of this that we're looking at a past event. There's those people who say we're looking at a still future event. And then there's those who would think of it in a more symbolic sense. And so this isn't basically the idea is you might be able to see things present here that are some of the things that Jesus speaks of here are symbolic of any age, from Jesus' coming until his second coming. So you see all these things happening. There's persecution in the church and stuff like that. So big questions are big questions I'm sure someone has is where do I stand on it, and how do we look at this passage? To be honest with you guys, I would not say that I am super dead set on a particular interpretation, meaning I have things that I think have sounded convincing from different schools of thought, but I'm always open to more information. I think this is a good understanding. I think this is somewhat a good approach to take with any passage, especially controversial passage of Scripture, which is, well, I've looked into the matter, and so far as I can tell, these are some of the things about it. However, I'm open to new information come along, and my thoughts may change on it. And to be honest with you, my thoughts on this passage have gradually changed over the years, over the last, I think I was first introduced to some of the controversy on this when I was about 19 years old or something. So we're looking at, do the math, 18, 19 years since then I've come back and looked at this passage. I'm not saying I've done a massive study of this, but I would say that some of my perspectives have certainly shifted over time. That said, let's kind of walk through this passage. I want to do a little bit different today. By the way, most of the things I'm saying here I've also said in my devotional this morning. Basically, when we look at Matthew's Gospel and we look at Matthew chapter 24, my go-to, I don't know if you call it my sweet spot, my jam, when we talk about Bible interpretation, is primarily what we would call biblical theology, meaning I'm very big on the internal cohesion in a book. So there are those who have done a much bigger undertaking than I am going to do here today, which is to show how what we read in Matthew 24 connects to what we see in Paul's letter to the Thessalonians or John's Revelation. I'm not going to touch on Thessalonians. I'm not going to touch on Revelation today. This is not really the goal of this study. The goal of this study is to look at Matthew's gospel. And so primarily for me, I want to look at how do the things we see here relate to the themes we've already mentioned in Matthew's gospel. As we already said, Matthew is an author who really likes to repeat themes and ideas over and over again. And so if this is such a jarring transition that we can't really connect it to anything else in Matthew's gospel, that seems pretty strange to me and means we're probably on the wrong track. So let's get into this and kind of walk through the passage a little bit. Okay, so setting the scene, Matthew 24 verse 1 says, Jesus left the temple and was going away when his disciples came to point out to him the buildings of the temple. But he answered them, "You see all these things, do you not? Truly I say to you, there will not be left here one stone upon another that will not be thrown down." Okay, remember where we're coming from, Matthew chapter 23 and such. Jesus did all these different things. He cleared out the temple in Matthew 20, in Matthew 21. He pronounces judgment on the scribes and Pharisees for their hypocrisy in Matthew 23. And then right before this, he said, "O Jerusalem, Jerusalem, that kills the prophets and stones those who are sent to it." So this is, and then he says in verse 38 of chapter 23, "Your house is left to you desolate," or abandoned, essentially. So what's happening here? I think we should understand this in the context of Jesus has already been pronouncing judgment on the religious hypocrisy that he sees in Jerusalem. It should be the hub of Judaism. This should be, if there's any place people should be able to look at in the world and say, those guys got it right, those people are wise, those people are following God, it should be Jerusalem. However, it's not. This is where we see the hypocrisy of the religious leaders, the scribes, the Pharisees, the Sadducees running rampant. And so as Jesus is doing this little Jerusalem sightseeing tour, or whatever it is with his disciples point out the beauty of the temple and all this, and Jesus is like, don't get too attached to this, guys. This isn't going to last. This isn't the end goal. And so he points them, basically it's a pretty simple thing to just say, don't put all your stake in this idea of the temple. Now, we move on in verse 3, and it says, he sat on the Mount of Olives, the disciples came to him privately saying, "Tell us, when will these things be?" What are those things? These things are the temple being destroyed. "And what will be the sign of your coming and of the end of the age?" Okay, so there's a question here. They were Jews, but the disciples, it seems to me, clearly connected all those events. That if the temple's destroyed, this must be the God coming in judgment, Jesus coming in judgment at the end of the age. It had, in their minds, I think they thought those things were so connected. The worship at the temple with Judaism, with religion, that for that temple to be torn down would be suggesting that essentially Jesus is coming to judge the earth. What I believe here that we see is that Jesus is explaining. Jesus is great at being vague. Jesus is sometimes intentionally vague with this stuff, but he explains to them, but I think he also is correcting a little bit of a misunderstanding. Jesus does this a lot in his Gospels. There was a belief, for example, there was the belief that the Messiah was just an earthly king, and he corrects it. No, the Messiah is not just an earthly king. The Messiah is God come in the flesh, okay? So he's already looked at, say, he's often doing this. People thought, well, Elijah must return from the grave, but in order for the Messiah to come, and he's like, no, John the Baptist, who comes preaching in the spirit of Elijah, he is the return of Elijah in that perspective. So Jesus is often taking ideas they have that are kind of off and tweaking them a little bit. And he does this all the time. And so what I believe he's doing here is taking this concept and kind of showing them, he's answering their question, but also separating them in certain ways. So he's showing them that you can't specifically connect the temple, the destruction of the temple, with the end of time, so to speak, or the way we think of it, or the end of the age. It's not really the end of time. It's the end of time as we know it, but it's the beginning of eternal life. It's the beginning of a new age as well, and so an eternal age. And so Jesus kind of unpacks this. And he talks about different things in here. See that no one leads you astray. Many will come and say, I am the Christ, and they will lead many astray. You will hear wars of rumors of wars. See that you are not alarmed, for this must take place, but this is not the end yet. For nation will rise against nation, kingdom against kingdom, and there will be famines and earthquakes in various places. All these are but the beginning of birth pains. Interesting thing here. I feel as though this is a thing that everyone points to. If you're kind of more lean a little more on the, I don't know how to say it, doomsday side of things, and you think everything's a sign of the apocalypse, you point out those things. But these, Jesus says, are just the beginning. And a lot of these things have come and gone as well. So we want to be quick to understand that, like, whenever there's a war, we shouldn't be so quick to go, that's the one. That's that war. That said, he does say that it is the beginning of something. So this is a sign of something. He says, verse 9, they will deliver you up to tribulation and put you to death, and you'll be hated by all nations for my name's sake. So there's tribulation with the disciples and the church. We see that running super prevalent in the early days of the Christian church, but it's also prevalent in our world right now. It's easy for us to look at our own situation and go, oh, it's really easy for us to follow Jesus now. So this must be a past or a future thing. But also we should acknowledge the fact that there's widespread persecution of Christians in other nations as well, and we should always remember them in our prayers. Okay. I'm going to skip ahead a little bit. Verse 14, he says, this gospel of the kingdom will be proclaimed throughout the whole world as a testimony to all nations. Then the end will come. So, one thing that marks the end of the age is the spread of the gospel through every nation. So this is an important thing. This should one of the things I promised I wouldn't go into Revelation with this, but I can't not bring to mind the ending of Revelation that says, "Come quickly, Lord Jesus, come quickly." So the idea is that the return of Christ is a good thing for us. We want to see Jesus return. We want to see him usher in the fullness of salvation, where we're saved from the very presence of sin, and we are able to love him, to follow him, and worship him, and live life the way we were always intended to be. It was always intended to be lived, without sin and death and sickness and suffering and all these things. So we shouldn't, as Christians, we should never look at it like simply like a thing of fear per se. The idea of Christ's return, if you're a Christian, should be something you're looking forward to, and we'll kind of get into that a little bit more as we go on. So we see that the end will come as the gospel of the kingdom is proclaimed throughout the whole world. He talks about the abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel. He says, "Let those." Now, here's something where I would say we start to look at things that are specifically different about some of the things he's talking about here. I think there's overlap. So I think there are things that are characterize the destruction of the temple, which may also characterize the end of the age and the second coming of Jesus. But specifically here, notice the fact that the threat is localized. So he says, when you see the abomination of desolation spoken of by the prophet Daniel standing in the holy place, let the reader understand, then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. Okay, so this seems to be a particularly Jewish persecution, a particularly Jewish event here, because it's something for which they could hide from, and it's particularly something for which they could flee from. You can't flee from the second coming, guys, and we can show that as kind of the contrast is when Jesus comes to judge the world, there's not like someone who can go hide under a rock and escape final judgment. It just doesn't work like that. And we see that a little bit more as we go further down when he talks about the coming of the Son of Man. Specifically, it's a more universal thing. Where am I looking? Verse. Then will appear, verse 30, then will appear in the heaven the sign of the Son of Man, and all the tribes of the earth will mourn. So we see this as bigger now. This is more universal. They will see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven with power and glory. And he will send out his angels with a loud trumpet and will gather his elect from the four winds, from one end of heaven to the other. So we see a contrast, I think, here from what the destruction of the temple, which is a more localized thing, with where those in Judea can actually flee from it, to the arrival of the Son of Man, which is universal, where the angels gather the elect of God from the four winds. There's a universal scope to it. So this is one reason I would cite that where Jesus is distinguishing between two types of events, at least here. And we go on. He talks about certain things. Also, we might look at the fact that there are some things that we can clearly see, as seen from the lesson of the fig tree. From the fig tree, learn its lesson. As soon as its branch becomes tender and puts out its leaves, you know that summer is near. So also when you see all these things, you know that he is near at the very gates. Okay, so there's a sense where we should be able to look at the times and be able to understand it, be able to kind of read the sign of the times. However, when we also understand here, verse 36, it says, but concerning that, okay, so then he says, heaven and earth will, truly I say to you, this generation will not pass away until all these things take place. Verse 35, heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will not pass away. Okay, but concerning that day, what day? I believe he's talking about the day in which heaven and earth will pass away. An hour no one knows, not even the angels of heaven nor the Son, but only the Father. Okay, so here we see a contrast again. In one situation, Jesus is saying, be able to tell the sign of the times. You should be able to, you can look at a fig tree and tell what season it is. However, when we talk about this time when heaven and earth pass away, he says no one knows. Only the Father knows. Not even the Son. Now, let me talk about that for just a second. I mentioned this in my devotional today, but I want to kind of unpack that just a little bit. How could Jesus not know something? Well, when you look at the accounts of the Gospels, what we find is Jesus is often, so we believe in the incarnation, that Jesus is both fully God and fully man. So Jesus took on a human nature. Now, part of that, it seems to be in the Bible, to show that by taking on human nature, Jesus also took on certain human limitations. For example, in, I believe, Luke's Gospel, it says Jesus grew in stature and in wisdom. So there were things he learned in this process of growing up and going from a boy to a man, going from a baby to a boy, and all that stuff. So what I believe he's expressing there is the fact that Jesus, in taking on a human nature, is not aware of when that date is because because that's part of assuming his human nature. So there may be different theories, different opinions on that. But if you were stuck with the question of like, well, how on earth could Jesus, if he's God, not know something? And the answer is when Jesus takes on certain human, it shows when Jesus takes on humanity, he by nature is sort of limiting himself. So people get hungry. Jesus says he gets hungry. God doesn't get hungry. God doesn't need food to sustain himself. He doesn't need anybody in that sense. Jesus needed those things. And so by taking on a human nature, Jesus is also assuming certain limitations that come with human nature. Okay? So, that said, moving on. I'm going to try to wrap this up for you guys. Also, this day and this hour is more like Noah's Ark. People were unaware when the flood came. People are going to be unaware when Christ returns. There's going to be a clear separation between the righteous and the wicked, between the saints and the sinners, between those who know Jesus and those who don't know Jesus. This is, I believe, the clear understanding of the illustration with the 2 men being in the field, one will be taken, one will be left. 2 women will be grinding at the mill, one will be taken, one will be left. So I don't think there's a specific clarity in here to show if the person who's taken is the elect, is a Christian, or if the person who's taken is a wicked person taken away to judgment. Either could be possible, I think, from here, and so I don't have a specific opinion on that. But what it does clearly show is a separation between these two. And then the question of the day is, like I said, there's an overlap of these things. So the good news is whatever perspective you take on this, I think the application of this passage is explicit and should be the same for everyone, which is to be prepared. Which begs the question, how do we prepare for these things? Well, we get to the illustration. Therefore, verse 44, it says, "Therefore you must also be ready, for the Son of Man is coming at an hour you do not expect." Okay, so application, be ready, because you don't know when Jesus is coming back. And then he gives this illustration. "Who then is the faithful and wise servant whose his master has set over his household, to give them their food at the proper time? Blessed is that servant whom his master will find so doing when he comes. Truly I say to you, he will set him over all his possessions. But if that wicked servant says to himself, 'My master is delayed,' and begins to beat his fellow servants and eats and drinks with drunkards, the master of that servant will come on a day when he does not expect, and an hour he does not know, and will cut him in pieces and put him with the hypocrites." There's that word again. Notice, we just got done with Jesus making a big statement against the hypocrites. In that place there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. So, how are we ready for the second coming? How are we ready for Christ's return? Well, we're ready by doing the work God has set before us. That's the master. God's the master of the house, right? And he puts before us certain responsibilities. These are the things we talk about all the time. We have a responsibility to love God with all our heart. We have a responsibility to love our neighbor as ourselves. We have a responsibility to follow his word and his commands. We have a responsibility to share the good news of Jesus with other people. The person who is doing those things and pursuing those things is a person who's preparing themselves and being ready for when Christ comes. And a person like that can look at whenever Christ comes and says, come quickly, Lord Jesus, come quickly. Why? Because they know they're preparing themselves. They know they're being prepared for the task at hand. So that's all I'm going to bother you guys with today. Look at that. We're almost exactly at 24 minutes. So 24 minutes on Matthew chapter 24. Okay, so just to kind of sum up, what's the idea? What's the big takeaway? Let's prepare ourselves to do the work God has for us. Some of these details we don't know. It's not wrong to look out to try to understand them. But even if we're wrong, if we're doing what God tells us to do, if we're pursuing righteousness, if we're pursuing a relationship with him, if we're sharing the gospel, if we're doing these things that we know that God's put before us to do, then we don't have to be worried no matter how all the details work out. So that's my thoughts for today, guys. God bless, and I will see you tomorrow.